Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of Gen Ed. I'm your host, Louis Freeland, just joined by the spectacular Ilana Schwartz. And today we have another guest for you after our short hiatus. She is the Partnership Development Director at MakeWay in Toronto, Canada, the former head of Marketing, Communications and Fundraising at World Wildlife Fund Korea, with a master's in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. It's Leanne Burton. Hello, Leanne.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're really happy to have you on the podcast today. And so, to start off with, I just gave a list right now of everything that you can find on your CV, basically. But is there anything that you would like to tell us about yourself, tell the listeners about yourself that would give maybe a fuller picture of who you are?
Well, you made me sound really accomplished, so I appreciate that. Sometimes we're just kind of in the grinds, and we might not be able to celebrate where we're at and what we've accomplished. So you gave me a moment there. Thank you. I think something that is worth noting in my experience is that I did not graduate high school. And a lot of people don't know that because I kept that to myself for a really long time. But now working in social justice philanthropy, I'm starting to become a lot more comfortable with sort of sharing my story. And so this is a great opportunity here today to do that as well. So yeah, in high school, I guess a lot of people, including my parents, would have considered me to be a bit of a wild child. I was always wanting to be out there and try new things and hang out with new people and push envelopes. I had some troubles at home, a bad relationship with my parents that caused me to decide to move out when I was 16. And I got my own apartment and I kept going with high school, but eventually I think it just all kind of became too much for me, managing the responsibility of being in school, kind of just really uncertain about my footing in the world, being the age that I was, and then working at the same time. And so I did end up dropping out of school and just kind of going on like a personal development journey, I guess. Now that I look back at it, I could say that that's what it was. But then I think at that time, probably the people around me thought I was being a bit of a failure, I guess. I got a little street involved after that. I started to do some backpacking. Actually, when I was about 19 years old, I wanted to kind of get away from the chaos of the streets of downtown Toronto. And I pulled out an atlas. You guys might not know what an atlas is. It's predates Google Maps.
Of course.
But it used to be in a book. I don't know if you knew that. And I got out an atlas of Canada and I opened it up and I covered my eyes and I just dropped a finger wherever it landed. And I said, I'm going to go to that place. And so fortunately, it was actually Jasper, Alberta, which is a really beautiful place out in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains of Canada. And that just started me on a journey towards, I think, really developing who I am today, in that sense of I became very connected to the environment. I did a lot of hiking and camping and just explored new things, rock climbing, etc. So I took what I call a 5-year gap year to just kind of figure out what was out there in the world. And slowly I made my way out to Vancouver and started to go to school there, which is where you would see Carleton University and Langara College on my resume.
I am so jealous that you went backpacking and hiking for, I would say, about 5 years. I am a hiking outdoor enthusiast. So while I'm not in my room with a textbook in hand, I'm always outside, especially today because it's really beautiful. But according to Louis, the the Canadian, it's hot. According to him, when it's really nice and cool outside for me in Texas. But
if it's above like 25 degrees, it's too hot for me. I'm sorry. I can't.
Yeah, so I'm really motivated by your finding yourself and your willingness to go on the path that wasn't taken, especially when everyone else, I think especially right now, it's you go to school, you go straight into university, and then you just try to go and leave a job. But then you're left just trying to figure out who you are, which is what you did first.
I'd say especially with APs that try and fast track that. You're kind of
Yes.
forced into a certain path before you can even really think
Yeah.
about what you're doing.
Especially
Yeah.
deciding at such a young age what you want to do for the rest of your life, which I think is very much unrealistic.
Mm.
So, Leanne, how did you decide, I'm going to go to school today? Why? You know?
Yeah. Well, part of my backpacking experience was 6 months in Central America, and I met someone on the road who was in, I think, his second year of university. His name was Dane. I don't know his last name. But he and I played chess on the beach and talked about philosophical topics throughout for a couple of months, and just like, no real agenda. And he just really, his view of the world really inspired me. And I thought, I want to go tap into that like wealth of knowledge and start thinking differently about the world. So, Dane, if you're out there, thank you so much. You inspired me. I hope you're doing well.
That's really, really interesting. And it's also really lucky that you didn't, like, when you were looking at that atlas, that you didn't fall somewhere in the middle of Greenland or something, get lost there up in the icebergs.
I imagine that would have been a beautiful journey as well,
Probably
but yes,
would have been, though.
I was lucky that Jasper, Alberta was so beautiful. So yeah, I mean, I guess when I decided that I wanted to go to school and I realized that I, didn't have a high school diploma, I don't recall being overwhelmed by the idea of getting myself prepared to go to university. So at that time, Capilano University had a general studies program that would help you get prepared for university if you hadn't graduated high school. And so I started doing that, and I remember thinking, wow, I really love education. I really love like stretching my brain and acquisition of knowledge and things that I wouldn't have been able to focus on in high school. I now was really enjoying doing, and then I would say like that kind of was the theme of everything into this point, which is just following my intuition and doing things that felt right all along the way. And that has served me really well. But it means that I've always been kind of the adult student in any of the other educational endeavors that I did, Humber College, Carleton University. I was always older, but so comfortable with that as well too. And I found that my peers also really valued that about me, that I had experience out in the world, and I was able to contribute to the work in the academic institution a little bit differently because of that. And I also appreciated my peers in that they had extensive academic backgrounds that I didn't have, and they were very intimidating, but it turned out we were intimidating each other in different ways.
You mentioned, so you went and you did a general studies program to prepare for university, and then after that went and started your university courses. Did you ever feel a certain amount of stigma around not having a high school diploma? Because I know that, at least from my personal experience, I feel like it would be quite difficult to actually get into university without, the strict high school diploma format.
Yeah, I did. It was very internalized, the stigma. I didn't tell anyone for a really long time. And like I had said at the beginning here, I haven't really started to talk about that part of my life until the last few years. And maybe it's because I'm feeling more safe and accomplished, but I think it's because I've become much more immersed in social justice, social equity issues. And I realized that this is actually quite a common story for many people. And when I look back at my high school years, I don't blame myself for not being able to finish. I was dealing with a lot more than a 16-year-old kid really should have to be dealing with. And so that's just my story and my journey. And I'm now proud to talk about it. But yeah, it was definitely internalized stigma for a long time.
And I see that after you did your general studies, you first went into applied urban and rural land use planning.
Yeah.
Then you moved on to fundraising and philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. So what made you decide to go into urban planning and rural land use?
Yeah.
Was it the backpacking, the trip to Jasper? And
It was all that. It was all the hiking, backpacking. I was inspired by my growing connection to land, and that led me to the urban planning program at Langara. But my focus was on sustainable development, so sustainable urban design for the purposes of climate change mitigation and adaptation as well too. And I really loved my studies. I mean, I think I would have just like gobbled up any kind of information at that time, but I really did love my studies. However, when I graduated, it was around the time that Vancouver had gotten the Olympic bid, and I knew there was going to be quite a windfall of urban development projects that were going to be only serving the Olympics and not necessarily the long-term sustainability view of the region. And I also looked at my job prospects, and it looked like I would just be working in a city planning office with a bunch of kind of older, dusty city planners who are uninspired and sort of lost their pizzazz for the craft. And so I chose not to work in that space, and I chose to come back to Toronto and work in the corporate space, which was very surprising to me. But yeah, I worked in the IT sector, and I started as sales. I was terrible at selling things, I'll tell you that, but I was successful in my job because I love people. And so I just built relationships with people, and they just bought things from me. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm glad it's working out. Like, I can't actually call someone and sell something to them. And so I moved through that company into marketing and employee engagement programs, and built some programs, and had a really good time doing that work. It was very creative, and I liked building things. I learned that here. But I didn't really like the implications of the IT market, I guess, the impact of the IT market on the environment. I still was very connected to the planet and wanted to find a way to honor my connection to the planet through my work. So that's what really led me to taking that program at Humber College to get into the charitable sector. I will say that I tried to transition from the corporate sector into the charitable sector without doing the Humber College program, and I found that it was really difficult. There was quite a sector-wide snobbery, maybe I'll say, to people coming from the corporate sector seeking to save the charitable sector. There's a bit of a saviorism kind of complex, people moving from the corporate world into the nonprofit world. And I may have had a little bit of that, to be honest. Like, I really had to prove that I was really committed to the sector and not trying to come in and save the day. And so I took that program, and I got hired at WWF right away.
And then with WWF, you worked first in Canada, I know, for a couple of years, and then you moved on to Korea. Would you like to tell us about how you got that position? Because that seems really out there. I mean, obviously you backpack all over North America, so maybe not that out there for you. But for a lot of people, getting a job all the way in Korea is, that's halfway across the world. That's really like perhaps a dream, perhaps a nightmare for some. So how did you get that?
Well, it was interesting because it wasn't the job in Korea that brought me to Korea. My partner, he works in engineering, and he had a job offer in South Korea. And so I looked at my prospects to see if there would be something that I'd be able to do, and actually it just worked out really well that at that time, WWF Switzerland was opening its next office in South Korea, the first office in South Korea, and that would be its next office. And so I basically positioned myself for that work, and I helped just basically establish the roots of the WWF program and the office. And it was very much a startup environment because the brand awareness of WWF in South Korea was, I think it was around 1% at that time, whereas in North America, it's 60-70%, right? So basically, we didn't have any brand equity to open doors and to inspire partnerships. So, yeah, it was a tough gig, and also a tough work environment in South Korea in general.
Could you explain a little bit about what WWF is?
Yeah, it's the World Wildlife Fund. They're an international ENGO. They have a little panda, that's their symbol, their logo, but they actually don't do animal protection directly. They actually do environmental conservation initiatives that lead to protection of species across the world. Each country has its own office and its own programming. And so my role with WWF Korea was to not only set up the bricks and mortar of the office, but also build the programming that's relevant to the Korean population.
Are there any particular initiatives that you remember that you're particularly proud of from your work at the WWF-Korea?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, the office is running now. It's fully staffed. It's doing well. Some of the people that I hired back then, which was 8 years ago, are still there. So to me, that means that the office has evolved into a productive work environment. I would say the things that I'm proud of the most. Gosh, there's so much. I will say it's a really stressful environment. I think I mentioned that earlier. The Korean work culture is really dedicated and committed, and the hours can be really long, and it's very hierarchical. And so basically, you stay until the boss leaves. Now, I was the boss then back in the day, and I would not want people to be working until late into the night, but those are some traditional work customs there. So I had to be the kind of boss that I pride myself in being, but also respect local customs and local culture as well too. And so even though some workplace traditions would to me seem like exploitive to human beings, I also had to respect just the ways of working and the culture locally. If I tried to undermine that by bringing in Western values, then I would be not being sensitive to local ways of operating. So I would say that that's something that I'm proud of. That was my own personal learning journey as a leader. I had to certainly become very, very humble and very aware of my privilege as a white person. In Korea, in general, you'll find foreigners in teaching jobs, but it's quite rare to find a foreigner in any other kind of job, corporate or nonprofit job. And I found that I was being quite ostracized for being a foreigner, a female for one, and also being quite young in the position that I was in. And I was constantly being criticized just for those qualities. And that's really my first experience of being judged for the color of my skin and my gender and my age. And I don't really experience that back in Canada. And it really kind of opened my eyes to what people that are not white experience all the time. And so it's important for me to experience that even in that small window, but I think it has led me to a lot of the social justice work that I am attracted to working in now.
And actually, yeah, I was going to ask about that precisely. So what prompted your transition back to Canada, back to Toronto, and working with MakeWay, where you currently work now?
Yeah, I think my partner and I just decided that we'd been there for just over 3 years. We were ready to come home. I was pregnant. We had done IVF in South Korea. And that's a whole other crazy experience as a foreigner to go through in South Korea, but it was awesome. I came back 4 months pregnant. I did do a little bit of job searching from South Korea in Canada. And because I was pregnant, and because of the experience that I had, I wanted to carefully choose who I worked with. So I wanted to make sure it was work that I could grow and develop in, and something that wasn't international. I wanted something that was very grounded in Canada, because at that time, there was a lack of mainstream knowledge around the experiences of Indigenous peoples in Canada and their traditional connections to lands and culture and land stewardship. And I wanted to learn more about that. And so that's part of why I chose MakeWay. But I also chose MakeWay because I knew that they would provide the kind of working environment that I wanted as a new parent. A very inclusive, supportive environment.
So it seemed you took what you faced in Korea, like the discrimination and prejudice, and you kind of influenced that in a way to impact those whose voices aren't being heard currently. What projects were you working on, or you currently are working on in MakeWay? And just a little bit like what MakeWay is about for those listening who don't know.
Yeah, sure. MakeWay is the least well-known $40 million foundation in Canada. And that's okay. We're pretty humble. We're pretty behind the scenes. We're very sector facing. We would call ourselves an intermediary foundation. So in Canada, there are public and private foundations, and then there's on the ground community work. We're situated in the system as an intermediary between the on the ground community work and the private foundations. And so we tend to build healthy pathways for funders and communities to pool their resources for community-led change. We're not an organization that has programming like WWF, for example, where they have regional programming, regional and issue-based programming. We go where we're invited as a charitable infrastructure, where we can support community-led change, as I had mentioned earlier. So I have the privilege of working with high net worth individuals, wealthy family foundations, also community change leaders. I get really inspired by the work that's going on in the fields. That's the wonderful part of my job. I think the challenging part of my job is seeing the tremendous inequities between what I am interfacing with in the community and then what I'm interfacing with on the wealth and philanthropy side of things. And sometimes I just have to remind myself that my role is to help build healthy bridges between those two spaces. But it's hard sometimes to see a tremendous amount of need and a tremendous amount of privilege in the other direction. But yeah, I guess in a nutshell, I build partnerships for social change. And I get to work with philanthropists that are very progressive as well, too, who want to engage in a different form of philanthropy than you might find at other institutions.
That's really interesting. I remember that I came across MakeWay when doing research for my nonprofit Curious about a year ago now. We were promoting a hackathon. I was reaching out to MakeWay for publicity support and all of that. At the time, I remember I realized that it was some kind of intermediary nonprofit, but it was rather abstract. The concept was rather abstract to me. Do you have any concrete examples of what you do in your role as the partnerships development director, or anything that you're particularly proud of, any projects that you have that you might be able to talk about?
Yeah. MakeWay is a little bit complex to understand. In fact, I've been there for 6 years, and I think it was around my second year anniversary that it clicked for me exactly what we were doing as an organization. So yeah, I mean, and it really comes down to us being an innovator, gap filler in the Canadian sector, and the Canadian charitable sector could be considered a complex adaptive system that's trying to adapt to changing political dynamics, changing global political dynamics as well too, and addressing the needs of the Canadian citizens all at the same time. So it's constantly moving and adapting and changing. And so MakeWay, being an intermediary, constantly has to move and adapt to those circumstances. So it's kind of hard to pin down exactly what it is and what we do at any given day. But in general, our mission is to enable nature and communities to thrive together. And we focus on social, environmental, and economic justice. And where those things intersect tend to be the place where we can be the most innovative. We have 2 charitable registration numbers. And so we have the MakeWay Charitable Society, and that is something interesting in Canada called a shared platform. A lot of people in the US might know of this as a fiscal sponsorship, and that's a common sort of construct in the US, but in Canada, it's quite rare to be able to enable multiple independent charitable projects to operate off of one charitable registration number. That's something unique that we do, and we do that in the pursuit of increasing access to charitable dollars and charitable infrastructure in Canada. That's not the work that I do, but I'm kind of adjacent to that work. I'm a part of the foundation, which is a separate charitable entity legally, and I manage all of the revenue channels, the philanthropy, the donor advised funds, the philanthropic advisory services, and yeah, I mean it's a pretty great gig. I get to work with leaders in environmental racism and leaders in freshwater protection, leaders in Canadian settlement services, refugee services. I get to understand what it is that they're trying to do and the unique work that they're doing, and then really try and mobilize funds from the philanthropic space into that work. So really trying to move resources from one place to another. And also influence how philanthropy is undertaken, because the money is one thing.
Yeah.
moving money from one place to another is one thing, but how you do it is so important, and especially in a social justice and equity space. So historical Western philanthropy is very much donor oriented in that donors have their own giving strategy, and they tend to have outcomes in mind that they want to achieve through their giving strategy. And it all seems really benevolent, right, on the surface. But if you peel back the layers, the more top down the donor to community dynamic is, the more oppressive it is. So the communities aren't necessarily doing what they want to do; they're doing what donors want them to do, and that doesn't always line up with what would lead to wellness for the community. And while I said that it seems quite benevolent on the surface, there are also questions around like motivations behind philanthropic giving, and also whether it's enough, right? And whether these contributions that are tax benefited are actually benefiting society, or alternatively, are they have more yielding private benefits than they are public benefits? I'm like in that really murky space now, trying to advance systems change on how philanthropy plays out in the Canadian sector, and how the government enables inequities of power by way of how the regulatory system is structured in Canada.
I've never really thought of that before, but you're right. Now that you say it, when you state it like that, it becomes pretty clear. Like, when you have powerful donors that are basically handing out money bit by bit, you really, you kind of recognize that it's not entirely benevolent, or even if it is, it has good intentions. The actual structure itself is kind of broken, and I suppose that's what you mean, what MakeWay means with the quote that traditional philanthropy alone is just not enough, which is a quote that I read on the website and that really struck me. As I was thinking, traditional philanthropy is not enough. I couldn't wrap my head around it, but yeah, it seems perfectly clear that this system itself is there's a certain amount of bias in there. So that's really, really cool. I suppose this is not at all what you expected on working in when you were in high school. And you started off on your journey. This was not at all where you were expecting to go. Working in philanthropy, changing the system, working with powerful donors and communities, and serving as that link.
I'm curious about what your experience was like studying philanthropy while in school, and how that is similar or different to what you're doing now. Like, did you expect, like, man, I want to go in and help others through these like social justice events, and now you're on a different side in that intermediate area? Is it are they teaching traditional philanthropy in school, or are they more progressive?
Well, it's interesting because my first educational experience that prepared me for the sector was at Humber College, and that was a fundraising program, fundraising management program. And that is at basically a job skills readiness institution. And so it was very much about, okay, this is how you manage a budget, this is how you fundraise, this is how you market. And that was great. It's a 2-year program that's crammed into about a year and a half. But the program, it does not really zoom out on like, what is this sector? What's the sector all about? Who are the stakeholders? Where does the power lie? What are we actually trying to accomplish versus what are we accomplishing? And where are the challenges and opportunities? So that educational experience at Humber was very much ground level and tactical. Then it would take me another 6-7 years in the sector to really crave more. And it was my work at MakeWay that really got me much more interested in systems change. And so I applied to get this master's degree while I was working at MakeWay. So I was working full-time, master's degree full-time, 2-year-old at home. Oh yeah, and then there was a global pandemic. But I loved it. I loved it. And again, I'm the older student again. I'm 42 years old, pursuing this educational or academic curiosity of mine. But it felt right. There was nothing in my body that said, oh, no, you shouldn't be doing this. Like, it just felt right. And I'm so glad I did, because then the bigger picture of the sector became much more in focus for me. And I mean, I'm still learning and growing and developing every day. I hope that's the case for my entire career. But now I'm starting to see areas where I could really make a contribution in terms of systems change and policy change in Canada.
Do you believe that it's your experience in the master's itself that brought you to see the big picture, or is it maybe working in the sector while studying?
Working in the sector, but not just working in the sector, working with an intermediary like MakeWay. So I get a lot of creative latitude in my work with MakeWay. They let me build things. They're very supportive, which is great. Like, I'm completely redesigning our donor advised fund program, which is a $33 million program, to be much more progressive and community oriented, where in the past it's been much more oriented to donors' interests and less about community. So it's really about, like, I think what has been really critical to this sort of next echelon of my career is that MakeWay is super supportive. They're very progressive and they want to be doing niche things. Whereas if I were working at a more traditional institution like a university or a hospital foundation, I wouldn't be getting that opportunity to be as creative as I want to be. And the program, the master's degree program that I did at Carleton, it's the only one in Canada. I think in the US there's a lot of master in philanthropy programs, but Canada, we have one. It sits in the School of Public Policy at a university that is really designed for alternative thinking. Yep. And they only allow, I think, 22 students a year into the program. And there was about 150 applicants. So I was really lucky to get into this. It's a very niche, like, portion of the economy and then also the charitable sector. So, I mean, it maybe, the average person might say, oh, only 150 people applied and only 22 get in. That doesn't seem too competitive. But in Canada, it really kind of is. And my work with MakeWay was one of the reasons why I got in. And in fact, let me just tell you also that high school, not having graduated from high school, actually was a barrier to me getting into Carleton University. So that, that was 25 plus years ago, but it became a barrier. They let me in on academic probation. And so for the first quarter or first semester of my studies, I didn't know if I was actually going to be able to stay in the program or not. And it was very, very stressful for me. But I was able to stay in, and I ended up being like top of my class in many ways. So
was it just academic probation, or did they, were there further measures, or is it just that they were hesitant?
They were hesitant. Yeah, okay. They were hesitant because my academic journey had not been the traditional one, right? Mm-hmm. Not been finishing high school, get your bachelor's degree, then, get a master's degree, and maybe this is your second master's degree. So a lot of the students that I was in this program with were coming from 8 years of school. And I'm coming from a real world experience in which I haven't been in the classroom in 10, 15 years. And I didn't have the high school diploma. So it still ended up being a bit of a barrier, but I was able to overcome it. And maybe that's why I want to talk more about that, I think, about taking non-traditional pathways to education. Because I don't think that people should be ostracized for choices or what life circumstances when they were 17 and 18 years old. I don't think that's fair. And I also think that, like, education pathways are diverse and they're rich and they're not always going to lead to a master's degree. I'm lucky that I was able to do that, but I also value life experience. A lot of the people that I work with in the communities are incredibly intelligent thought leaders, and they have not had a formal education like the one that I've been able to get. So I don't know if your listeners want to hear that, but
I think it's important, though. I think it's important. The choices that you make, they have an impact, and people will see it and people will judge. But at the end of the day, it doesn't close doors for you. You can always find a way.
You can always make way. I think, yeah.
Sometimes you just have to pick a place on the map.
I also see that the employment sector is changing a lot. The minimum requirements of a sciences degree is no longer, I don't think parents are as much talking to their kids about, what the kind of degree that you get is going to have an impact, is going to decide whether you've got a place in this world or not. I think people are taking really unique pathways forward now, and I think employers are now having to really become much more flexible in that way as well too. So I mean, maybe it's just because I'm in the social change sector, and so I see a lot more progressive approaches than maybe someone who works in the corporate sector might see. But
Hey, we've had guests on this episode. One was wanting to do architecture and then went into IT, or Japanese and went into coding. So many different pathways that are not your traditional. And I feel like those episodes are pretty inspiring to listen to, and they're pretty motivating.
They are indeed, just like this one. And in fact, we're
Yes.
reaching the end of this episode. And so I'd like to ask the question that we ask at the end of every single episode, which is, if you were to give a talk or a piece of advice to students that are about to graduate from high school and not too sure and want to maybe follow in your footsteps a little bit, what would you tell them?
I would say that you don't have to have it all figured out in your late teens and early 20s. If you really want to go to school right away, just know that your instincts might lead you into places that you didn't expect as you go forward, and to really try and listen to that. And if you don't want to go to school right away, hopefully you can take some time to roam the planet and explore who you are on the planet before you make those big life decisions.
Words to live by.
Words to live by, indeed. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Gen Ed. We will see you all next week with a yet unscheduled guest. We're going to find one. Sometimes we find guests on a week-per-week basis, but we will see you all then. All right. Bye-bye.